My name is Jeff Kenny. I work in the Office of Institutional Diversity at Oregon State University. Hopefully you're watching this video because you have an interest in shifting your behavior for anti-racism. Our conversation today is going to review the thought, feeling, and behavioral work that underpins advancing anti-racism at a place like Oregon State University and any other community you find yourself in. A few outcomes are possible through this video. One, you may be able to make sense of the multiple, connected, and messy dimensions of social justice education. It's also possible that you might walk away with a sketch of your own personal learning agenda for anti-racism. It's also my hope that as a result of your time spent in this video and the resources I'll share, that you grow increased enthusiasm for anti-racist learning and action. The outcomes I just shared are in service to a much larger goal. In a racist society, neutrality is not an option. That means when we stagnate, are unwilling to shift our thoughts, our feelings, our beliefs, or behaviors that sustain the status quo, we are reproducing inequality, violence, and pain. The focus of this video is individual change. The imperative of this work, however, is at the collective scale. The work of shifting our individual patterns is preparation for participation in larger and more comprehensive collective action. This video was designed with a particular frame in mind. The following conversation intends to shift the thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and behaviors of a predominantly white audience. And in that process, I will focus my examples and illustrations on the epidemics of anti-Blackness and anti-Indigeneity. Anyone may benefit from this video, and I want to underscore that white people have the most to learn and the most to do. So with those frames in mind, let's initiate some reflection. Before I barrel into concepts and resources, take some time for yourself right now to consider your goals as a learner for anti-racism. What is the vision you have of a world that more actively and effectively combats racism, and how do you hope to show up in it? With this imagination, consider what you have and what you need to participate in your vision. I have three specific questions to guide your reflection. What do you need to know that you don't know now? What do you need to feel or work through that you don't now? And what do you need to be able to do that you can't do now? These questions underpin the outcomes of this video and will serve as the scaffold for our conversation going forward. Feel free to pause the video to write or process your thoughts with a peer before you move forward. The purpose of this video is to get you on your learning edge. Wherever you're at, let's push you further into places where you can grow more capable of resisting racism. Whatever your current level of competence, be it personal, professional, or academic, let's get you to your limit, find your discomfort, and then lean into it. Our learning edges exist in three-dimensional space, and we have a lot of them. And within each of us, we have important thinking work and feeling work and values work to do. But here's the real talk that I want to underscore before we go much deeper into this conversation. None of that work about thinking and feeling and beliefs matters if it does not produce measurable shifts in your anti-racist behavior. Understanding concepts, experiencing empathy, or resonating with particular values alone does nothing to resist racism. Nothing. What matters is your behavior, whether or not you confront racial microaggressions, your willingness to revise a budget to equitably redistribute resources, to eliminate policies that produce inequity, or organize and stand with others to insist upon cultural change. Those are the things that actually matter. And here's the caveat. While anti-racist behavior is our goal, we won't sustain anti-racist behavior without examining and reconciling our thoughts, feelings, and beliefs. Thought work, feeling work, and belief work is necessary so that our behaviors are informed, they are assured, and they are congruent. So we have to do all of it. In my role at OSU, I spend a lot of time thinking about how students, faculty, and staff learn regarding issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think learning is an apt word, but sometimes in conversations like this one, I'm reminded that what we're really talking about is how individuals change. And so in some ways, learning describes the process ahead of us, and in some ways it doesn't. A behavioral shift is a process of change. Just because we learn something doesn't necessarily mean we do anything different. So for instance, I have learned about the positive health effects of daily exercise, or I've learned about the negative health effects of smoking, but learning about those things might have done little to shift my behavior, in particular running. So the cognitive work commonly associated with learning is just one piece. If we're aiming for behavioral change, our notion of learning needs to be more comprehensive or transformative. We need to find edges of not just what we know, but how we feel and what we believe. A sustainable change in behavior often requires attending to these dimensions because our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors inform one another and ultimately produce our behavior. So what does it look like to mutually advance thought work, feeling work, behavior work, and belief work? I think it's a lifelong commitment to discovering the limits of our knowledge and cognition, increasing our capacity to recognize and manage our feelings, reflecting upon the value and efficacy of our actions and inactions, and the congruence and utility of our belief system. And it's pretty complicated. So the aim of this conversation is to help you make sense of the many ways you need to learn and grow to sustain anti-racist behavior. Here's a visualization to summarize the assertions that I've just made. This triangle represents who we are, a constellation of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And these corners of the triangle are in direct relationship with one another. What we think affects how we feel and act. What we feel affects how we think and act. And what we do affects how we think and how we feel. An alignment in one area can positively impact another. Similarly, misalignment can also undermine potential of the other. And at the center of this relationship is our core beliefs. I think about our beliefs as the sun to our thought, feeling, and behavior planets. Our beliefs have gravitational pull and set our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors into motion. And this motion can be for the better or it can be for the worse. So this is our roadmap of learning for anti-racism. And I'll walk through what it looks like to find your learning edges in each of these areas. Let's kick off with the cognitive dimension or thought work. So what are our thoughts? Whatever they are, there are a lot of them. They're all day. And for some of us, they are relentless. And not all of our thoughts are the same. Some thoughts are necessary, like thinking about what we're going to eat, where we're going to sleep at night, how we're going to get our work done today. Some thoughts are inconsequential, superfluous, that don't have an impact to our daily success, our wellness, and so forth. Some thoughts are positive, and when we think them, they make us feel good and connect us in positive ways to the world around us. And some thoughts are negative, that when we experience them, they produce uncomfortable feelings or they disconnect us from the world around us. Thought work is about examining the content of our thoughts, but it's also about examining the process and context of our thoughts. So where do our thoughts come from? What are their patterns? And what impact do they have on our feelings and on our decision-making? When we do anti-racist thinking work, we examine the content and processes of our thoughts to confront cognitive errors and logical fallacies, to develop beyond simplistic or dualistic thinking, to correct misinformation and our limited knowledge, perhaps to expand a narrow vision or myopic thinking, or thinking about things in ways that are too small or too close, and growing our own self-awareness about who we are and how we're in relationship to one another and the types of thoughts that govern those relationships. And those are a lot of things to consider. So here's 2 resources to help you initiate your thought work. The first is a comprehensive list of logical fallacies or thinking errors. So the ways that we might argue or reason with one another that are not strong ways of drawing conclusions. When we engage in ad hominem attacks or build straw man arguments or bandwagon our logic or appeal to authority, this is kind of an old school approach to argumentation, a rational logic that can help you map patterns of thought that may or may not be producing strong conclusions. The second resource I have for you is the Harvard Implicit Bias Test, or Project Implicit. This is a research-based inquiry that, as a result of your participation, you get some insight into either your positive or negative sentiment to different groups of people as it relates to gender or to race or national origin. And this is a type of exploration that can reveal to you aspects of your cognition that are difficult for you to discover on your own. And those are just two small activities to get you going in this process of thought work. And there's a whole lot more you can do. So for instance, you might consider engaging in perspective taking, and this can be done in a lot of ways through travel, literature, podcasts, and film, and quite possibly doing each of those things in a way that's different from the way that you're engaging in them right now. It can look like critical inquiry through scholarship or structured debate or engaging in dialogue with your peers. It might look like appreciative inquiry, where you explore the value systems and cultural organizing of Black and Brown leaders, not from a place of critique, but from a place of curiosity and trust and admiration. And lastly, it can look like metacognitive exercise. So just practicing recognizing and naming the types of thoughts you're having and creating opportunities for yourself to shift those patterns in directions that are more conducive to anti-racism. Each of these activities has potential to shift the content and nature of our thoughts in ways that enable us to manage our emotions and sustain anti-racist behaviors. So I want to acknowledge that at this point, that might feel like a lot of things to consider and explore and engage in, and that's real. And anti-racism work is hard and it's complicated, and there's a whole lot more that I've got to share with you. So in addition to the thinking work we just discussed, now let's turn to your friend and mine, feelings. Now, if you're anything like me, you were raised in a culture in a family system that provided a meager emotional education. I was taught very little about how to recognize my feelings, how to describe them, or communicate them to myself and to other people. Feelings are a powerful force that for many of us live in the background, and in the background, they shape our thoughts and our behaviors without recognition and without management. Feeling work for anti-racism is about increasing our emotional and sensory vocabulary and acquiring tools to direct our feelings towards positive ends. So here are two resources to help you initiate some feeling work. The first is an emotional literacy wheel. When I was growing up, we had like 3 words to describe what we were feeling: happy, sad, and mad. This literacy wheel is a reminder of the rich vocabulary we have to describe the complexity of human experience. And for many people, just encountering this wheel is a huge step in them coming to understand themselves better and the emotional processes of other people. So engaging with an activity like this is just for you to practice describing what you're feeling with more words than you currently do now. The second is an inventory of sensory experiences that commonly accompany our emotions. We don't always readily recognize the physical correlations with things like anger and sadness and grief and anxiety and despair, right? In addition to feeling angry, maybe we are clenched and constricted and hot and our stomach is knotted. And in addition to feeling scared, we also feel cold and shaky and shivery and trembly. And in addition to feeling anxious, we feel choked up or dizzy or nauseous or tingly or twitchy. Getting in touch with our feelings means getting in touch with both our emotions and the sensations of our body. And I'll talk in a little bit about the significance of recognizing both our emotions and our sensations as it relates to advancing anti-racist behavior. Perhaps not surprisingly, unrecognized and unmanaged negative feelings tend to steer us away from anti-racist behavior and our social justice goals. To make sense of the relationship between our feelings and behavior, I find a tool called the ACT matrix helps aid in reflection and make connections between our emotional triggers and our behavioral responses. The ACT matrix is really basic, and if you have a piece of paper and a pencil, all you got to do is draw 2 lines and answer 4 questions. And I'm going to walk through that with you right now and give you some examples of how one might answer questions like this. So the first question we ask ourselves is in the bottom right-hand corner, and it's who and what is important to you. And the ACT matrix can be used for a lot of things in our life, but here we're specifically going to talk about our goals of anti-racism. So in addition to realizing a society that mitigates, eliminates, or actively resists racism, maybe we also value practices of restorative justice and repairing past harms and living in a community that's grounded in compassion and grounded in hope. So then we ask ourselves, what feelings have been getting in the way of moving toward what's important to you? So if our Values are over here. We have feelings that are pulling us away, sometimes almost in the opposite direction. So some examples of feelings that get in the way of taking steps towards anti-racism include guilt and shame, feelings of defensiveness, fear, and self-preservation. The idea that anti-racism might hurt us, our standing in society, or our access to resources. And then a number of physical responses, in particular, adrenal responses. So panic, fight, flight, and freeze, right? A sense of terror, both big and small, that can send us fleeing from the work of anti-racism. And so after we take time to recognize the feelings that have been getting in the way of us moving towards what's most important to us, we ask ourselves, what have you been doing so far to deal with the feelings that you don't want to have? Because it's really distressing to experience guilt and shame and defensiveness, and nobody wants to live in fear. And unconsciously, a lot of the things we do to manage those feelings isn't what's helping us take steps towards anti-racism. So some really common practices that folks will engage in to mitigate some of these uncomfortable feelings. They may engage in color blindness, where they assert and pretend that they don't see racial differences in society and devalue racial differences as a type of liberal progressivism. Maybe they engage in victim blaming. They reconcile the pain of seeing racial inequality as blaming the people who are surviving it. Maybe they fall into silence and they avoid spaces and people and conversations that evoke some of those difficult feelings. And maybe they hoard resources out of fear, fear that they might have access to less as a result of realizing racial equity. And so now that we've taken the time to both recognize our feelings and our kind of autopilot behavioral impulses to those feelings, we can now ask ourselves, what behaviors can we engage in that will move us toward what's important to us while also managing those difficult feelings? Because we can't pretend like those feelings don't exist. They have to be cared for. We just need to be caring for them in a different way. So some places to begin to start walking towards our values is acknowledging the reality of racism, taking responsibility for our piece of racism as it manifests today and the privileges we've inherited from racism of the past, speaking up against racial injustice and connecting with others in the work, and very importantly, sharing power and sharing resources. So resisting the propensity to hoard and become a part of the redistribution of power, particularly among people who've been denied access. Completing an exercise like the ACT matrix can spur reflection on our values, push us to identify our feelings, acknowledge unproductive behaviors, and imagine a new course of action towards anti-racism. The ACT matrix is just one example of what feeling work can look like, and there's a whole lot more. So for instance, you might consider focusing on moving through shame and guilt, two powerful emotions that can keep people from advancing really important anti-racism work. Maybe you need to focus on mitigating your propensity to become defensive or personalize conversations around race and racism. Maybe you have your own grief work to do as you become increasingly consciousness of the realities of racism and racial inequality, to grieve the loss of the beliefs and paradigms that you held prior to that learning. And it also looks like normalizing discomfort, disorder, and unpredictability. This work is not tidy, it is not linear. And if you experience apprehension around being in that kind of mess, that's a great place to start doing some of your feeling work so that you can show up productively for anti-racism. So let's talk in even more practical terms, what it can look like to improve your emotional literacy. My number one recommendation is engage in dialogue and reflection with other white people. Spaces with folk who identify as white or benefit from white privilege, to name and process your emotions in ways that doesn't require the emotional labor of people of color. It's also important to make space and feel your feelings, to honor them, to acknowledge them, and create an opportunity to move through them. And throughout the course of your day, practice recognizing, naming, and subsequently managing your emotions. And now that we've talked about thinking and feeling work, let's consider our behavior more closely. Behavior is virtually everything we do and don't do. The movements we do and do not make, the decisions we do and do not make, and I want to emphasize inaction, or the choices and movements we do not make as an important behavioral dimension, as inaction often fuels racism. And we can characterize our behaviors in a number of ways. Our behavior can be direct or indirect. Our behavior can also occur unconsciously, much like breathing or blinking. Our behavior can be habitual, like driving and reading signs or waving to people that we know. And our behaviors can also be complex, like solving problems or cooperating with new people. Each of these types of behaviors are relevant to the work of anti-racism. Here are more concrete examples of what it can look like to engage in anti-racist behavior. We might confront the verbal slurs, slights, and microaggressions of white people and other people who benefit from white privilege. We might intervene physical and emotional violence when we see it taking place. We might uplift the knowledge, values, and leadership of Black and Brown people in pursuit of racial justice. We should resist our propensity to sandbag or obstruct anti-racist progress, reject impulses to hoard power and resources where we have authority to redistribute power and resources, and pursue truth, reconciliation, and restoration. And of course, these anti-racist behaviors are easier said than done. There are investments we can make that will help us learn, model, and sustain anti-racist behavior. A few examples include skill-based education, so undertaking implicit bias training or bystander interventions so that we know what to do or what to say when manifestations of racism percolate in front of us. To engage in community organizing, to form relationships and see how other people are engaging in direct action or cultural change. To join personal and professional learning communities, to learn and reflect with people with similar goals, and to participate meaningfully in processes of restorative justice that attempt to reconcile past and present harms against Black and Indigenous folk. So now that we've reviewed thought, feeling, and behavior work, let's consider the role and significance of our core beliefs, the dimension of ourself that sustains the motion of other dimensions. I want to acknowledge that it can feel vulnerable to broach the topic of personal beliefs, in particular beliefs that connect to issues of racism. My purpose in raising this topic is not to proselytize a particular belief, but to offer you an entry point for self-examination. If you aspire for social justice or are committed to anti-racism, through reflection, you may find that some of your beliefs are not serving you well in your endeavors. As such, belief work is about recognizing what our beliefs are, their implications for our goals, and reconciling new beliefs with our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. So what are beliefs? I'm going to start by using some really fancy language, and then we're going to break it down bit by bit. Generally, our beliefs can be categorized as existential, evaluative, and prescriptive. Fancy. Existential beliefs answer questions about what is true and how can we know what is true. Evaluative beliefs answer questions about what is good or what is morally correct. And prescriptive beliefs help us answer questions of how we should live or how we should organize society and live together. And these types of beliefs constitute what some social psychologists and cultural theorists regard as worldview. These beliefs are the lens through which we view the world, process information, and make choices. And as such, it is important to examine our worldview and consider how various beliefs we hold either serve our goals for anti-racism or undermine them. I would argue that the following existential beliefs obstruct anti-racism. The belief that there is a reasonable and legitimate explanation for the occurrence of all things. The belief that violence and inequality are natural and inevitable, or the belief that scientific and quantitative methods are sufficient to understand the world and make decisions about it. Some examples of obstructive prescriptive beliefs might include each person is wholly responsible for their own success or failure. The belief that maximizing individual rights and choice will ensure fairness and equity, or the belief that sharing resources undermines the motivation and the potential of others. And in the evaluative dimension, limiting beliefs include the assertion that poverty is a reflection of character and individual choices, the belief that people who do not share my beliefs and values have succumbed to evil, and the belief that colonization is necessary for the progress of humanity. Each of these beliefs imbue and sustain thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And it is worth your time to examine thoughts like these for their congruence in your vision of anti-racism. Doing belief work requires that we surface often unexamined or unspoken beliefs regarding human nature and behavior, life and the natural world, the order of society, consciousness and cognition, and the nature of knowledge and truth. And this is some pretty deep stuff. So here's a couple of resources to get you going on this exploration of your core beliefs. The first is the Colco Rivera Worldview Inventory. Sneak peek into the literature of worldviews. Nobody agrees. It's a big old mess, consternation all over the place. But I find that this inventory doesn't lay claim to the specifics of worldview, but just discusses the various facets across the literature that are included in the conversation. So if you want to dive deeper into any of these dimensions and get overloaded with a whole bunch of heady questions and hardy questions, I encourage you to review this beliefs inventory. The second is a self-assessment from the Harvard University Good Project that challenges you to rank and negotiate values that are common among lots of people. So if I was to sit across from most of you and say, what are the 5 things you value most in the world? Most of us are kind of stunned with the question, maybe even don't know where to begin, that without intention, our values are not clear to us. And I recommend an inventory like the Good Project as just a place to start, not the end all be all. There's going to be values you have that guide your life that aren't on the inventory, but this is a place where you can begin to connect with some of your authentic core drives, things that govern your behaviors in the world. Both of these resources can provide you language and map the terrain of the types of beliefs that inform your commitments to anti-racism. And those resources are just a start. Anti-racist belief work can look like a lot of things. Foremost, it's about examining your socialization and how you were taught to be. Beliefs are not innate. They are not naturally occurring. They are imbued within us in the earliest phases of our life, and they continue to be affected by the people around us till the last days of our life. And so beliefs tend to be instilled in us at an early age from people we trust more than anything in the world. And belief work looks like telling the story of where those beliefs come from and how they look different to the socialization of people all around the world. It means continuing to engage in values clarification above and beyond an inventory like the Harvard Good Project. It means taking time to declare for yourself what you believe and examining assumptions that maybe you've parroted from earlier times in your life that you haven't actually concluded for yourself, and ultimately reconciling your beliefs with your anti-racist goals, understanding what are some of these core drives you have and whether or not they are serving you towards anti-racist ends. And I do not want to minimize the intellectual and the emotional labor of belief transformation. It's not easy, it's not quick, and what I'm sharing with you isn't the end-all be-all guidance, but it is some places to begin and to kind of feel your way around and initiate the process for yourself and potentially others. Some ideas about what you can do to stimulate belief transformation. First is continue as many opportunities as possible for self-reflection and examination, to continue to explore culture and take perspectives. And then I absolutely encourage intra-group dialogue and intergroup dialogue as a function of belief transformation. So either critical discussions with people whom you share an identity or critical discussions with people across identity. And it's in these spaces that you have an opportunity to tell and to listen to stories, find connection, receive pushback, and wrestle with the complexities brought about by other people's worldviews. So there you have it, one way of imagining the individual process of change for anti-racism, albeit a multifaceted one. And this approach is one that asserts the necessity of meaningful engagement with thoughts, feelings, and beliefs, ultimately to sustain anti-racist behavior. And again, thoughts, feelings, and belief work is important, but it is only valuable if it produces demonstrable behavioral change. If you want to learn more about what diversity, equity, and inclusion learning can look like, you may find utility in the Office of Institutional Diversity's guidance for DEI learning. Our guidance helps translate many of the concepts discussed in this video into concrete knowledge, skills, and attitudes into various work contexts. You'll find examples of DEI learning applied to institutional roles like support services, administration, teaching, and research, and a whole lot more. So I encourage you to take a peek. You can find that guidance and many more resources by visiting our website at diversity.oregonstate.edu, where you'll also find connections to the good work of educators taking place across campus. Lastly, if you're interested in learning in more detail about the concepts discussed in this video, I encourage you to explore the references which informed my lecture. Other than that, that's all I have for right now. Thank you so much for your time and attention.